Our nation is in crisis. It is not a constitutional crisis because the law, the Constitution, is whatever the people in charge say it is. What we have right now is a legal coup. Some good news, however. Early Saturday morning, the Supreme Court temporarily blocked Trump's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act that he used to justify deporting Venezuelan gang members to that prison in El Salvador. Immediately after, Trump's Solicitor General, Dijon Sauer, filed a 17-page motion asking the Supreme Court to reverse its order. The Supreme Court must decide on that. But now, the Washington Post reporting Donald Trump on Sunday might invoke the Insurrection Act. Yes, the man who led an insurrection could invoke the insurrection, granting him almost unlimited emergency powers to put down an imaginary rebellion along our southern border. He can do it without congressional approval, without congressional oversight. It would grant the president powers to call in the National Guard and our military to calm a national uprising of what he calls illegal immigrants. Border crossings are now at a 10-year low. You might remember that on his very first day in office, his first day back in office, January 20th of this year, Trump signed an executive order calling the imaginary border crisis a national emergency, and then, on that same day in his executive order, demanded that the head of Homeland Security and our Pentagon chief report back to Trump in 90 days on whether they think he should invoke the Insurrection Act to tamp down this imaginary emergency at the border. Well, Sunday is April 20th, I believe, yes, and that would be the 90th day he's been in office. That 90-day deadline is up. Kristi Noem, our free-thinking, independent head of Homeland Security, and our alcoholic defense chief, Pete Hegseth, have to make their recommendations on Sunday. Sometime on Sunday, Hegseth and Noem will tender their recommendations as to whether they believe Trump should invoke the Insurrection Act to quell an emergency at the border, an imaginary emergency at the border, at our southern border where crossings are nearing a 10-year low. Well, what do you think their recommendations will be? What do you think Kristi Noem and Pete Hegseth are going to say? Now, this doesn't mean Trump is going to invoke the Insurrection Act on Sunday. It means he will probably receive recommendations written, no doubt, by his Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, but coming from Kristi Noem and Pete Hegseth, recommendations that he invoke the Insurrection Act. I want you to be prepared for this. Be prepared for Trump, at the very least, to be announcing that it has been recommended that he invoke the Insurrection Act. Now, with the Supreme Court temporarily blocking Trump's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, will Trump reach into his quiver of roughly 150 emergency powers and invoke the Insurrection Act? Why wouldn't he? He has 149 other emergency powers at his disposal. Expect the worst. Expect the worst. Be surprised if anything good happens. I think he will invoke the Insurrection Act sometime next week. I hope I'm wrong. Because Congress is controlled by Republicans, there will be little debate and nobody to stop him. He can invoke the Insurrection Act. Congress can defund that, but not this Congress. And don't count on our Supreme Court. Be pleasantly surprised but don't count on the courts. This is a legal coup d'etat, and it's going to be very hard proving Donald Trump has broken any laws, because elections have consequences. In America, the law and the Constitution are whatever the people in charge say they are. The Supreme Court's immunity ruling last July pretty much reinforced that. So let's stop calling this a constitutional crisis, because the Constitution now says whatever the people in charge say it says. What we have is a political crisis. People took to the streets again this weekend. Thousands and thousands and thousands took to the street all over America in all 50 states to protest Donald Trump. That is the answer. To organize, to boycott, to speak up, and not get arrested. Do not get arrested. Do not surrender control of your body to the state. On today's show, why this is a political crisis and not a constitutional one, why you need to speak up. Real courage is knowing and speaking the truth and being responsible with that truth. The truth is we are in a political crisis, and only a fool would depend on this Supreme Court. Maybe this Supreme Court could surprise us, but don't bet on it. Use your First Amendment rights, organize, vote, boycott, defend your country locally, and keep an eye on the 2026 midterms. This is the Mop-Up. I'm David Feldman. Thanks for finding me. And yes, there's going to be a 2026 midterm election. Trump wants you to think there won't be. You're doing his work for him when you say he's going to cancel the 2026 midterms. Don't be an idiot. Of course, there's going to be a 2026 midterm election. So, please like this episode so I remain in your feed. The Supreme Court blocked Donald Trump in an early emergency ruling early Saturday morning from deporting about 30 suspected Venezuelan gang members. Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act on March 15th of this year to justify rounding up suspected Venezuelan gang members who he designated as terrorists. Trump stated America is at war with Venezuela. He stated Venezuela has invaded our nation. Venezuela sent, Trump said, members of the Tren de Aragua gang, terrorists, into the United States on direct orders from Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro. That's according to Trump's March 15th executive order, and these claims are repeated by the Trump Justice Department in their court filings. Trump and his Justice Department arguing that the president of Venezuela ordered members of this gang of terrorists to murder Americans, kidnap Americans, and wage war against the United States. Trump, invoking the Alien Enemies Act on March 15th, said he possesses wartime powers not invoked since Franklin Roosevelt placed Japanese American citizens in concentration camps. Immediately after signing his executive order back on March 15th, Trump then deported several hundred so-called terrorists to that notorious El Salvadoran prison known as the Terrorist Confinement Center, claiming these violent gang members are Venezuelan-backed terrorists. The key word here is terrorists. On that very same day, March 15th, Trump launched airstrikes on Yemen to take out Iranian-backed Houthi terrorists. I'll come back to Yemen in a second. The progressive media right now is performing a great disservice because they only report why Trump and his administration are wrong, why they are fascists, and why Trump can't succeed, because if he succeeds, he will destroy what's left of our representative democracy. All that is true, but the progressive media, journalists, owe it to their followers, to their listeners, to explain what Trump is going to argue, what his enablers claim to believe. You and I need to know how and why this Supreme Court is going to justify protecting Trump. We need to know how and why Republicans will protect Trump. Otherwise, we are powerless. The truth, we need to know what we're up against. I cannot stress this enough. The current leadership swore an oath to the Constitution, but right now they are violating it. And because they control the White House as well as both chambers of Congress and the Supreme Court, it is no longer a constitutional crisis. It is a political crisis. Only gaining political power will save us. I am partisan. I am a leftist. I am a Democrat. I am a progressive. I believe Trump is a fascist. But he can't be defeated until we understand the fake legal and intellectual undergirdings to what his enablers are arguing. So, Trump is stupid. But he parses language quite artfully. And I believe there is a reason he launched those airstrikes against the Houthis in Yemen on the very same day he invoked the Alien Enemies Act to deport the Venezuelan migrants. His legal team, I believe, will connect the two. And I fear by doing so, they will give the Supreme Court just enough legal cover to protect Donald Trump. They will give House and Senate Republicans just enough legal cover to protect Donald Trump. On March 15th of this year, Trump justified the missile attacks on Houthis in Yemen by saying he was taking out Iranian-backed Houthi fighters in Yemen. So if they're Iranian-backed Houthi fighters instead of homegrown Yemeni fighters, that makes them terrorists. On the same day, March 15th, Trump justified deporting Venezuelan gang members by referring to them as Venezuelan-backed terrorists. Nobody's talking about this, but I believe in about a week, this is where the argument is heading, and it's going to leave the progressive media, as well as progressives, flat-footed and stunned. Again, I'm not defending Trump. I'm telling you what his legal team, what Mike Johnson in the House of Representatives is going to argue, and I fear nobody on our side is prepared for this. As I told you on our last show, the Washington Post reported that all of Trump's spy agencies told him earlier this April that we haven't been invaded by Venezuela. Of course we haven't been invaded by Venezuela. We also know this country wasn't invaded by the Houthis in Yemen, but that hasn't prevented Donald Trump from ordering more airstrikes against Houthi rebels in Yemen without congressional authority. Again, this is very important. On the very same day Donald Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act to round up migrants, on that very same day Trump declared a state of war exists between the United States and Venezuela. On that very same day, Trump ordered missile attacks on the capital of Yemen to take out Houthi terrorists. We know at least 13 civilians were killed by those airstrikes, perhaps as many as 5 children. And since then, Trump has been launching airstrikes throughout Yemen as recently as April 17th. That would be last Thursday, where more than 74 people were killed after a U.S. missile strike took out fuel supplies along Yemen's Red Sea coast. Now, does a state of war exist between the United States and Yemen? Were these airstrikes authorized by Congress? Was Congress consulted before these airstrikes? The answer is no. But after the March 15th airstrikes, the scandal in Washington was over too much transparency and not enough secrecy. The scandal in Washington was that the war plans for the attack on Yemen had been shared in a group signal chat among Trump's top security officials. The scandal isn't that Trump didn't seek congressional approval. The scandal was his attack on Yemen wasn't opaque enough. So, what is he doing fighting the Houthis? Who gave Donald Trump this authority? I believe our Supreme Court is going to rule. I believe this Republican-controlled Congress will argue that Donald Trump doesn't need a war authorization from Congress to invoke the Alien Enemies Act to round up Venezuelan migrants for the very same reason he doesn't need a war authorization to launch airstrikes on the Houthis, because they're going to say he already has that war authorization. It is a war authorization that's almost 24 years old. Remember? Some of you are old enough to remember that war authorization. Again, I don't believe it's a coincidence that Donald Trump launched the airstrikes against Houthis on the very same day he invoked the Alien Enemies Act and declared a state of war exists between the United States and Venezuela. The key word Trump uses when describing members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua is terrorists. The same way the Houthis are terrorists. Why? Why? Right after 9/11, nearly 24 years ago, Congress passed a war authorization giving the commander-in-chief broad powers to fight a global war on terror. Now, there was a separate war authorization to invade Iraq. That was a separate piece of legislation. Immediately after 9/11, on September 18th, 2011, what is that? 7 days, a week after 9/11, Congress passed the authorization for use of military force in the global war on terror, and it's still in effect. That was the war authorization that provided legal authority for our country to invade Afghanistan. In the nearly 24 years the war authorization was voted on, it has remained in effect. It has been renewed over the years. Presidents from George W. Bush to Donald Trump right now have cited this specific war authorization to launch military operations in more than 22 countries, including Syria, Somalia, Libya, and now Yemen. And I believe on Venezuelan gangs here in the United States. Trump hasn't said that yet. I believe you're going to be caught flat-footed if you don't think he's going to say he's justified in waging war on Venezuelan gangs in the United States because of this 24-year-old authorization to wage a global war on terror. A global war on terror that authorizes any president to fight terrorist groups wherever he decides they're located. And I believe the Trump administration will soon be arguing that this authorization to wage a global war on terror gives him the authority to wage war on Venezuelan gang members, or as he calls them, terrorists, or anybody else he decides is a terrorist living here in the United States. Doesn't matter that every intelligence agency, according to the Washington Post, told Donald Trump that Venezuela isn't attacking us. Because it didn't matter that every intelligence agency told George W. Bush that Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction and didn't attack us on 9/11. I believe this is why these Venezuelans are being called terrorists. And I believe Trump, who is very cagey, this is why Trump is sending those Venezuelan, quote-unquote, terrorists to El Salvador to be housed inside CCOT, an acronym standing for the Terrorism Confinement Center. It's called the Terrorism Confinement Center. When Donald Trump, Solicitor General, argues before our Supreme Court, he's going to say, in order to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, the president doesn't need an act of Congress that says we're in a state of war with Venezuela, because he already has a war authorization. It's the 2021 Global War on Terrorism authorization, which, by the way, was renewed back in 2023 when Joe Biden was president and Chuck Schumer, Democrat, ran the Senate. As long as you call these Venezuelans terrorists, you don't need to debate whether a war exists between the United States and Venezuela. At least that's what Trump and the Republicans are going to argue. This is incredibly important. And to refresh your memory, right after 9/11, which was 24 years ago, Congress surrendered its war-making powers to the president by passing that war authorization to fight a global war on terror. What does that mean, a global war on terror? Whatever the president decides it means. Bush was president. The Republicans at the time controlled the House of Representatives, but Democrats had a 51-49 majority, and they could have blocked not just that war authorization, but the war authorization in the following year to wage war on Iraq. Okay? The Democrats controlled the Senate in 2002. They could have stopped the invasion of Iraq. And, as I just said, in 2001, they could have prevented passage of that authorization for what has now become a permanent war on terror. But they didn't. And they continue to reauthorize the global war on terror. with this war authorization, which is purposely vague, allowing any president to decide where terrorists exist and when to launch military strikes unilaterally against these terrorists without congressional approval, because the president already has congressional approval. Here's the headline that you should take away from this show. As long as Donald Trump keeps referring to the Venezuelan migrants as terrorists, Venezuelan-backed terrorists, the same way he refers to the Houthis in Yemen as Iranian-backed terrorists, Republicans are going to argue, and I believe the Supreme Court will rule, that he requires zero authorization from Congress to wage war against these terrorists because he already has that authorization. It's 2001's authorization for use of military force in the war on global terror. Past 1 week after 9/11, and still in effect, the president is free to wage war against anyone he deems a terrorist. This is what D. John Sauer, the Solicitor General representing Trump before the Supreme Court, is going to argue. It's what Mike Johnson, the Speaker, is going to argue. It's why Trump didn't need congressional approval before launching military strikes on March 15th in Yemen, because he was attacking Iranian-backed terrorists, the Houthis. It's why he believes by declaring Tren de Aragua a transnational terrorist organization, he is free to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, giving him wartime powers granted to him by the 2001 authorization for use of military force in the war on global terror, a war authorization that was renewed as recently as 2 years ago by President Joe Biden and a democratically controlled Senate. Again, I'm not defending Trump. I believe there is no legal justification for what he's doing, but I also believe so long as this vaguely worded 2001 authorization for use of military force in the war on global terror remains the law of the land, then we remain a nation in a permanent state of war against whomever the President of the United States designates to be a terrorist, domestic or foreign. Those Venezuelans are domestic. They're terrorists. Who else can he deem to be a terrorist? I cannot stress this enough. 1 week after 9/11, a Republican-controlled House of Representatives and a democratically controlled Senate gave George W. Bush this authorization to fight a global war on terror, to fight terrorists wherever they may be. And that was the authorization to invade Afghanistan, because the Taliban, which they were the ruling government of Afghanistan, they weren't behind 9/11. Al-Qaeda was. And Al-Qaeda was hiding in Afghanistan, as well as Pakistan, as well as Saudi Arabia, and throughout the entire world. But this is the war authorization that provided a legal undergirding to America sending troops into Afghanistan. The nation was traumatized by 9/11. Within a week of those attacks, Congress literally signed away its war-making authority. Within 1 week after 9/11, George Bush had free rein. The guy who ignored the intelligence reports telling him that Osama bin Laden was intent on flying jets into the World Trade Center within 1 week after George W. Bush crapped the bed on 9/11, Congress handed him war-making powers to fight a permanent war wherever this genius decided there were terrorists. This was less than a year after George W. Bush and the Supreme Court stole the presidency. Democrats had control of the Senate at the time. They handed an illegitimate president unlimited war-making powers. The very same war-making powers that Donald Trump currently possesses, war-making powers I believe this Supreme Court will decide are not within their purview to take away from a president. Now, again, there was a separate war authorization for the illegal invasion of Iraq. That came about in 2002. The Democrats controlled the Senate. They could have blocked the invasion of Iraq, and they could have blocked this permanent state of war, that the war authorization that came after 9/11. The Iraq war authorization expired, but the authorization for the global war on terror, first signed into law in September of 2001, is still very much in effect, which means when Donald Trump designates Tren de Aragua a terrorist organization, which he did on February 20th, then under that 2001 war authorization, he's going to argue, Mike Johnson's going to argue, the Supreme Court is going to argue that Trump is well within his right to invoke the Alien Enemies Act without congressional approval, because he already has it. He has that 2001 war authorization. The same way he didn't need congressional authority to attack Iranian-backed Houthi terrorists in Yemen on the very same day he invoked the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelan terrorists and then ship them to that terrorist confinement center in El Salvador. The terrorist confinement center. Like I said, Trump is quite artful at parsing language. And there's a reason on Saturday when Trump officials attacked the Supreme Court for issuing a temporary restraining order on the deportations to El Salvador, they kept calling these migrants terrorists, because that's the argument. They're going to claim his wartime powers to deport these terrorists to the terrorist confinement center in El Salvador. All these powers flow from the 2001 war authorization to use military force in our war on global terror. Again, people complain, like they say, why are you making the argument for Trump? I'm not making the argument for Trump. The progressive media is doing a disservice by not explaining to you what they're going to argue. And this is, I believe, how the Supreme Court, our venal Supreme Court and our equally venal Republican-controlled Congress, will fail our democracy and protect Trump. Now, I blame everyone for this, including myself. I blame everyone for years and years of complacency. We are all culpable for allowing this vaguely worded authorization for a global war on terror to place the United States in a permanent state of war. And we never worried. We never debated when we had Democratic presidents, when we controlled the Oval Office and both chambers of Congress. We never worried Too much power had been surrendered to the commander-in-chief with this war authorization. I've been doing this show for 16 years. How many times have I called for Congress not to renew the war authorization on the global war against terror? Maybe twice, and it wasn't full-throated. I mean, I don't even, a couple of times I said, maybe this is a bad idea. Because I was complacent. It didn't bother me. It should have. It didn't bother me, especially when Obama and Biden were president. And this, I am telling you, is the ticking legal time bomb we're going to be up against. And we're all to blame. We are all to blame, including me. 2 years ago, in 2023, Joe Biden, and we had the Democrats controlling the Senate. They renewed the authorization for military force in the global war on terror, continuing to hand any president a blank check to use our entire military as the commander-in-chief sees fit, with little to no congressional oversight. Permit me, how are we doing here? I'm getting angry. Permit me 2 cliches. The first cliche, the truth will set you free, and that is, it's a cliche, but it's true, and it will set you free. The other cliche is we're only as sick as our secrets, okay? The dirty secret making political discourse so sick right now is we're not approaching a constitutional crisis. This has nothing to do with the Constitution. This is a political crisis. And when we say this is a constitutional crisis, it's a lie and it's making us sick. The truth is Donald Trump, like all authoritarians before him, isn't breaking the law. He's not breaking the law. That's the dirty little secret. And until you say Donald Trump isn't breaking the law, you will remain as sick and as dangerous as that lie. It is a legal coup d'etat. Accept the truth, because it will free you to realize the courts will not save you. Only politics will. The same way politics saved Donald Trump. But for politics, Donald Trump would be in prison. Like Putin, like Orban in Russia, like Netanyahu right now in Israel, like all the authoritarians in Central and South America throughout the 20th century, like Hitler, when authoritarians assume power, no laws are ever broken. They're only rewritten by the legislative branch and reinterpreted by the courts. That's the story of fascism. Fascism is rarely, if ever, against the law. And you're wasting time by calling this moment something it's not. When you call this a constitutional crisis, it presupposes some knight brandishing the scales of justice will ride in on a white horse and save us. Calling this a constitutional crisis infantilizes the American people. It says, don't worry, we have lawyers and judges who will protect you. By believing this is a constitutional crisis, it only gives the authoritarians, the fascists, inside the Republican Party to concentrate more of their powers. This is a political crisis, and if you're looking for a solution, go no farther than Bernie and AOC and the massive rallies held this weekend across our country. This is about the will of the American people. This is about peaceful assembly. This is about organizing, boycotting, peacefully working locally and legally by standing up to fascists. Relying on the courts is a suicide mission. When have the courts in recent memory saved us? They've only Citizens United, giving the presidency to George W. Bush. They've only concentrated power for the billionaires. Maybe I'm wrong. God knows, I hope I'm wrong. I just don't think there's going to be a legal solution to Donald Trump until there's first a political solution. Trump's a convicted felon. A lot good that did us. The courts found Donald Trump liable for sexual assault and defrauding banks and lenders. He has numerous convictions under his belt. He's still under criminal indictment down in Georgia. The courts won't save us. They saved Trump because Trump knew there's only a political solution, and the courts would obey that political solution. Had Trump lost in November, I don't believe the courts would have saved him. I believe right now he'd be looking at serious prison time. Elections have consequences. More consequential than Supreme Court rulings. There must first be a political solution, then the courts. And only then can the courts save us. I want to be pleasantly surprised by this Supreme Court. I doubt they will surprise me. Early Saturday, the Supreme Court pleasantly surprised me. It issued on Saturday a temporary halt to Trump's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act in the deportation of the Venezuelan migrants, or as Trump wrongly labeled them, terrorists. So I'm going to go a little into the weeds here, okay, on what the courts are saying. And I kind of poured over some stuff here. My notes are, I'm trying to, I read mainstream media, I read the leftist press, and I don't think they do a good enough job explaining the courts, because the courts do a piss poor job explaining themselves. They don't write in clear English. So it's very exclusionary. If you stick with me, I will try to remove the patina of obscurity and try to explain to you what's at stake here and what's being argued. Okay? Now, authoritarian regimes always have an army of lawyers to ensure their leader can never be accused of violating the rule of law. In the end, repeating myself, but that's how you learn, I believe the Supreme Court is going to rule that the authorization to wage war on global terror gives a president broad latitude in waging that war. I believe they're going to rule it is not up to the Supreme Court to decide where the war on global terror gets to be fought. So they will uphold, eventually, Trump's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. Can't you imagine the court saying this? Can't you imagine reasonable people agreeing with the court? This Supreme Court, I suspect, is going to rule that if our nation is unhappy with how its president prosecutes our 24-year-old war on global terror, then the American people have two options. Vote for a Congress in 2026 that will revoke that global war on terror authorization. The other option is vote for a new president in 2028 who will either prosecute the war on terror differently or declare victory in the global war on terror, fat chance, and ask Congress not to renew this war authorization. That even if Bernie and AOC or Elizabeth Warren or Kamala becomes president, nobody, the people have to demand an end to this war authorization on the global war on terror. Again, it's lazy to wait for the courts to save us. The real work should have been getting rid of that 24-year-old war authorization back when Biden was president, back when in the first 2 years of Joe Biden's presidency, when Pelosi was Speaker and Chuck Schumer was Majority Leader of the Senate. Now, even if we did get rid of the war authorization, Trump would still be able to find some legal justification for deporting these migrants. Because in the end, there is always a legal justification for anything, including genocide. Including genocide. As I keep telling you, the courts won't save us. Only politics. Only winning will save us. Only outnumbering them will save us. Leave a comment. I'm sure there are many examples of the courts saving a country from fascism. I'm at a loss. I can't think of one. Tell me in the comment section. All I know is practically most, if not all, fascist regimes never ran the danger of breaking the law. I hope I'm wrong. Leave a comment if you think this Supreme Court is capable of ruling otherwise. But let's sit in the truth. Both parties, Democrat, Republican, willingly surrendered war-making powers to the president. And right now, I believe a convincing argument, not convincing to me, but a convincing argument can be made that unless Congress gets rid of this 24-year-old war authorization to fight a global war on terror, a president, Democrat or Republican, can officially designate any group of people as terrorists, and he can do pretty much whatever he wants to them. Donald Trump is a fascist. Donald Trump is a fascist. And when you look back at history, fascists, generally speaking, seize power legally. They rule legally. Hitler came to power obeying Germany's laws. Obviously, the brown shirts resorted to illegal violence, but all of Hitler's policing powers were rubber stamped by the Reichstag, that would be the German parliament, and then approved by the courts. Concentration camps, not against the law in Nazi Germany. Within 2 years of taking power, the Reichstag, that would be the German parliament, passed what are called the Nuremberg laws, which defined who was a German citizen and who was not. It was perfectly legal. Only those with German blood were allowed to be citizens. By law, Jews, blacks, gypsies were stripped of their citizenship. They weren't allowed by law to practice law, to teach, to own a business, or eventually even work for one. And there was nothing illegal about any of it. Within months of Hitler taking power, legally, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, which granted Hitler broad powers to imprison anyone he deemed a terrorist. Anyone he deemed an enemy of the state. Perfectly legal to decide for for Hitler to decide who the terrorists are. My nephew was in the emergency room last night for a minor cut. It was a minor cut, but he went to the emergency room. And one of the first questions he got asked was, "Are you an American citizen? Are you an American citizen?" Sorry, but we have to ask. Well, you didn't have to ask 100 days ago. So what's going on with that? Well, when there is economic precarity, like there has been in this country for decades, when the economy doesn't work for half our population, people like Trump make the people who are left behind feel special by conferring status upon mere citizenship. And this is, we're discovering, all about status. They are finding that the people who voted for Trump feel threatened by their economic, racial, and or sexual status. Straight white male Christians were feeling looked down upon. They felt they had lost their status. And Trump makes them feel special by making citizenship special. By virtue of your birth, American citizens get to go to the front of the line. And as long as this government continues to persecute non-citizens, American citizens who voted for Trump will feel a false sense of pride. They will feel they've regained their status. But in order for American citizens to feel they've regained their status, you have to torture non-citizens. You have to make stupid Americans feel like being an American citizen is like being a member of Mar-a-Lago. It comes with special privileges. And those special privileges are you don't get tortured the way non-citizens do. That's how Nazi Germany worked. That's how authoritarian regimes work. Are you a citizen? And when you're asked, are you a citizen, and you say yes, and you can prove it, you feel a sense of relief, and subconsciously you feel safe and maybe even a little bit special. The law won't save you. It rarely does, because the people who make the law, the people who interpret the law, the people who enforce the law won't save you. They only mirror the wishes of the people they answer to. The law only saves us when we vote decent people into office. In the end, what will save us is the math. After the show, go look at what went on in our country, on the streets in all 50 states. Go look at the record number of people turning out to see Bernie, AOC, and Coach Waltz. What will save us is there are more of us than there are of them. What will save us is the millions still working inside our government, inside our courts, inside our military, who know they cannot follow illegal orders. And that's why Trump wants to fire everyone. Gutting the administrative state isn't about saving money. Elon Musk just admitted that he can't keep his promise of cutting $2 trillion from our annual budget. That's what he promised, that he's going to find $2 trillion. He just admitted the best he can do is $150 billion. And even there, he's stretching it. This isn't about saving money or efficiency. It's about wiping out the resistance from within. Trump is firing anyone who resists him, anyone who's disloyal. So this is why we have to win local and state elections. It's why you need to protest. By protesting, you're reminding the people still working for us inside our government, inside the police, inside our military, that they answer to us, not Donald Trump and the billionaires. Showing up as you did this weekend and will continue to do, showing up to protest peacefully, reminds our police and our military whose side they are constitutionally obligated to be on. It's why we need to win the House and or the Senate in 2026. I have told you about the countless Western observers who say they have never seen a 21st century democracy fold as quickly as ours has during the past 90 days. Well, I disagree. I don't think we have folded. I don't. What laws have been passed? What enabling acts, what Nuremberg laws have been passed? Lake and Riley, and that does give broad powers to ICE, Lake and Riley. But ICE is running out of money. They have to lift the debt ceiling by July, maybe August. ICE has no money. It's not as though in the first 90 days, Trump and the Republicans have changed the law. Executive orders are not laws. And as much as the courts are not going to save you, the lower courts have succeeded in stalling practically 90% of Trump's executive orders. It's when they get to the Supreme Court. But that's going to slow things down until the midterms, until stuff makes it to the Supreme Court. There's a lot of paralysis before these executive orders being challenged in the lower courts make it to the Supreme Court. And stop saying Trump is going to cancel the 2026 midterms. I know some of you think you sound smart saying that. It's the height of stupidity to say that. It's what Trump wants you to believe. And I see these comments. People write to me. They leave comments below. It's just cynical. And cynicism is stupid. Because being cynical, you're doing Trump's work for him. There are going to be elections in 2026. There are still elections in Hungary. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment. I don't believe they're winning. I think they're scaring us. I think he's passing executive orders that are destroying lives. But we're fighting back, and so are the lower courts. A little gratitude on my part, because I'm pretty negative, saying the courts aren't going to save us. I need to be grateful for all the lower court judges Joe Biden and Barack Obama picked, as well as some of the lower court judges Trump picked, who George W. Bush picked, who even Reagan picked, who are slowing down, if not blocking, this lurch towards autocracy. So when it comes to the courts, in the end, the problem is the Supreme Court. That's our problem, the 6-3 majority in the Supreme Court. The lower courts, most of the lower courts have laid down the speed bumps. When it comes to our Supreme Court, there's Amy Coney Barrett and Chief Justice John Roberts, who might surprise us, but don't bet on it. The lesson is win back power. And when we do win back power, and we will, we must remember this moment in time and put in safeguards that protect us for when we lose power. We will win back power, and we will lose power, and then win it back again. Civil libertarians, including Senator Rand Paul, the Republican from Kentucky, have been warning Americans and Congress for years that the authorization for that war on global terror handed way too much arbitrary wartime powers to a president. But both parties and most Americans ignored these civil libertarians. Calling what we're going through a constitutional crisis whitewashes history. It exonerates you and me, and it places the guilt squarely on Donald Trump's shoulders when all of us gave the car keys to someone completely out of control. Yes, Trump's leading us off the cliff, but we didn't pass enough laws to make sure the car stops running when someone drunk with powers behind the wheel. Don't let yourself off easily by calling this a constitutional question. Instead, ask yourself, what law is Trump disobeying if he officially designates Tren de Aragua, a terrorist organization? What law is he disobeying, invoking that 24-year-old war authorization to call Tren de Aragua terrorists and then send them to that El Salvadoran terrorist confinement center? What law is he violating? Tell me in the comments section. I hope I'm wrong. All right, I'm going to wrap it up. I want to talk about the roots of this crisis. How am I doing here? Is anybody still? All right, I'm going to talk about something else. I think it's interesting. There is the possibility that Donald Trump is going to invoke the Insurrection Act. At the top of the show, I told you that after 90 days, he issued an executive order, his first day in office, saying the head of our Pentagon, the head of our Department of Homeland Security have 90 days to advise me as to whether or not to invoke the Insurrection Act to deal with the uprising along the border. So it goes beyond the Alien Enemies Act. One could argue the roots to this crisis run deeper than what powers we gave the president after 9/11. One could argue that we can find the original source of all this in the National Emergencies Act signed into law on September 14th, 1976, by then President Gerald Ford. These emergency powers, by the way, have nothing to do with war. They involve natural disasters, economic emergencies, epidemics like COVID, domestic uprisings and riots. George Herbert Walker Bush invoked one of these emergency powers when Los Angeles rioted after the Rodney King verdict. 2 years after Watergate, 2 years after our nation learned what presidents were capable of, 1 year after the Church Committee held hearings on how presidents abuse the CIA, how presidents abuse the Internal Revenue Service, abuse the FBI. After all that, after we learned all this, a democratically controlled Senate and a democratically controlled House of Representatives handed a bill for Gerald Ford to sign, giving a president vast and almost unilateral powers during a national emergency. And they left it just vague enough for a president to declare a national emergency with or without Congress. Now, some of these emergency powers, they're about 150. If they're invoked by a president, some of them must be renewed by Congress. Some of them don't require congressional renewal because they don't require congressional approval. At any president's disposal right now, thanks to the National Emergency Act of 1976, the president possesses about 150 individual emergency powers, 150 individual opportunities to declare a state of emergency exists. Most of those require some input for Congress, but not all. So, what keeps, or what has in the past, kept a president from abusing those emergency powers? Norms, human decency, and a sense of obligation towards the general consensus of what constitutes the rule of law. That's it. In the end, when Congress passed the National Emergency Act of 1976, Congress passed that, and they did that by deciding they would simply have to trust the American people not to elect a tyrant. Even Richard Nixon had his limits. Not Trump. You can't say the American people didn't know who Donald Trump is, certainly after January 6th. The American people knew exactly who they were electing. A tyrant, as well as a convicted felon. Now, he didn't win by a lot. He didn't even win by a majority. It was a very close election. Maybe stolen. I'll entertain that idea. But as far as we know, as far as the polling tells us, more Americans voted for Trump than Kamala Harris. So can anyone say they're surprised by anything Trump has done or plans to do? One could argue that the only thing Donald Trump is guilty of is keeping all his campaign promises. Democrats should try that. But first they have to make promises. So, back to the Supreme Court. As I just said, the lower courts might save us, just not the Supreme Court. The problem is the Supreme Court has a majority of right-wing fascists, and they get to overturn the lower courts where there's hope. But the lower courts can succeed in slowing Trump down. buying us time to regroup so that we can win the midterms. All right. Anybody still here? I doubt it. This is really interesting, though, and it makes me hopeful. And it even causes me to pause and wonder, maybe some people inside the Trump Justice Department and Department of Homeland Security may need to be pardoned by Donald Trump. Okay? Back to March 15th of this year. There is a lot percolating inside, down below, with the lower courts. And what's percolating may force the Supreme Court to do the honorable thing. They may have no choice. So before those flights took off on March 15th, Judge James Boasberg, the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, he was appointed by George W. Bush. He was Brett Kavanaugh's roommate at Yale Law School. Judge Boasberg, on March 15th, issued a temporary restraining order blocking ICE from flying those migrants to El Salvador. Despite that order, those flights took off. And this is a major issue that will go before our Supreme Court. And I don't see how even this Supreme Court can protect Trump's Justice Department from criminal prosecution. I think they'll protect Trump, but I think Pam Bondi, our Attorney General, I think this Justice Department, I think they've opened themselves up to criminal prosecution, and they're going to need a pardon from Donald Trump. This story is complicated because it involves our courts, but it's huge, and I'd like to go over it with you. I don't blame you for turning the show off right now, and I don't blame you if your eyes begin to glaze over. But let me introduce this to you, and in the coming weeks, it will begin to make sense because you'll be forced, if you're paying attention, to read about this. The question before the Supreme Court in a couple of weeks will be, is this Trump administration in criminal contempt of court for defying Judge James Boasberg's March 15th order blocking those flights to El Salvador? We're not talking civil contempt. Judge Boasberg, is talking about criminal contempt. Those are the words of Judge James Boasberg. Judge Boasberg on March 15th called for a 2-week halt of the flights to give him, and if necessary, the Supreme Court, time to decide whether the president has the right to invoke the Alien Enemies Act to justify these flights. He invoked a restraining order to give the court time to rule whether the men on board those flights were entitled to a habeas corpus hearing in order to determine whether they are, in fact, terrorists. The Trump administration defied that restraining order. The flights took off, and those men were turned over to El Salvador. So, currently, and this is a big story, it's underreported, but it's big. Hard to follow, but it's big. Judge Boasberg is about to hold hearings as to whether members of the Trump administration should be prosecuted for criminal contempt of court. He's about to do this. He's put a hold on it, but he's about to do this. Judge Boasberg said he plans to hold hearings to determine who exactly within the Trump administration gave the order for those flights to take off on March 15th. Who in the Trump administration defied Judge Boasberg's order that is criminal contempt to defy a judge's order. Judge Boasberg said, once I find out who is responsible for ICE defying my order, there is a distinct chance I will make a criminal referral to the Justice Department to prosecute the person or people who defied my order. And then Judge Boasberg added something that I have never, ever seen before. Judge Boasberg said, in the likely event that the Trump Justice Department does not act on my criminal referral, because considering someone inside the Trump Justice Department will probably be the subject of that criminal referral, Judge Boasberg sternly said and put into writing that he would take the extraordinary step of appointing his own prosecutor separate from the Justice Department's to try this case of criminal contempt. I have never, ever heard a federal judge tell the Justice Department, I'm going to appoint my own prosecutor to look into what exactly is going on inside your Justice Department. And I know your eyes are glazing. I know this is hard to digest. Let me repeat. The judge is threatening to appoint his own prosecutor to try this case, especially if he finds the Trump Justice Department is in criminal contempt. He's saying, I told you those flights to El Salvador needed to either not take off or be turned around. You defied me. Who defied my order? I want the name. Who in the Justice Department? Who in the Department of Homeland Security? Who in the Trump White House told the pilots land in El Salvador? This is unheard of for a judge, Judge Boasberg. This is unheard of for a judge to threaten to appoint his own prosecutor to prosecute possibly Pam Bondi. And Judge Boasberg, he is the chief judge of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. He served on both the United States Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and was chief judge on the United States Alien Terrorist Removal Court. He isn't some freelancer. Now, I'm not going to put too much faith in Judge Boasberg. I've been burnt before when I put way too much faith in Robert Mueller. However, if you do read the Mueller report, he says Trump is guilty, we just can't prosecute him. Mueller said Trump is guilty of covering up Russiagate, but you can't prosecute him because it is not our policy to prosecute sitting presidents. So I say the Supreme Court isn't going to save us, yet on this, they may be boxed into a corner on this. They may protect Trump. I don't see them necessarily protecting Pam Bondi, Kristi Noem, the head of the Homeland Security head, Todd Blanche, the deputy, the assistant attorney general, and Emil Bove, the deputy assistant attorney general. I mean, they're going to have to come possibly to Trump for pardons. I can see the Supreme Court, based on their immunity ruling, protecting Trump, but not the people who work for him, not the people following his orders. The Supreme Court never said they're immune from criminal prosecution. They're going to have to be pardoned by Trump. Now, is anybody still here? I apologize. I like to do shorter shows. And I want to get off some of this stuff and talk about other things, but I got to get through these notes. Before I get your hopes up, here's the argument, Pam Bondi. Here's the argument the Trump Justice Department will try to make. Here's the argument they are already making when they say that they're not in criminal contempt of court. I don't want to get your hopes up. So, theoretically, someone from the Justice Department could possibly end up in prison for criminal contempt of court. Rarely happens. But criminal contempt of Congress also rarely gets prosecuted. And we know Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon each spent 4 months in a federal prison last year for criminal contempt of Congress. People rarely go to prison for criminal contempt of Congress. Peter Navarro, Trump's trade czar right now, spent 4 months in prison for criminal contempt of Congress. He ignored a subpoena from the January 6th committee. Steve Bannon ignored a subpoena from the January 6th committee. They were sent to prison for 4 months. That rarely happens. So here is Bondi's argument, okay? Before you get your hopes up. And remember, Biden was president, so there was no way Bannon or Navarro could get pardoned. They had to go to prison. So here's going to be Bondi's argument. In mid-April, the Supreme Court took the migrant case away from Judge Boasberg. He issued a 2-week halt on those migrant flights, but then in mid-April, after his halt was defied and then expired in mid-April, our Supreme Court took the migrant case away from Judge Boasberg by saying the Washington, D.C. Circuit Court, where Judge Boasberg presides, that's the wrong jurisdiction. The Supreme Court said the migrants must bring their case before a circuit court judge who presides over the district where the migrants are being detained. That's Louisiana and Texas. I think it's the 5th Circuit Court. So the Supreme Court, about a week ago, ruled that for the time being, the president can invoke the Alien Enemies Act. Now, early Saturday, they said now he can't. But last week, the Supreme Court ruled for the time being, the president can temporarily invoke the Alien Enemies Act, but all migrants subject to deportation under the Alien Enemies Act must first be given a habeas corpus hearing inside the district they're being held. So they can argue that we're not gang members, we're not terrorists. The court ruled because none of these migrants were being detained in Washington, D.C., this case was no longer Judge Boasberg's jurisdiction. So Trump's attorneys are arguing that they're not in criminal contempt because the Supreme Court eventually ruled this isn't Judge Boasberg's jurisdiction. They're arguing it's the height of stupidity. They're arguing Judge Boasberg lacks the authority to hold them in criminal contempt for violating his initial restraining order on March 15th. Okay? It was stripped of his jurisdiction recently. It was his jurisdiction when he issued that restraining order. But this is the argument they're going to have to make, that Pam Bondi is going to have to make before the Supreme Court. And I don't see how this Supreme Court, as venal as it is, can lend any credence to this argument. It undermines the basic constructs of Article 3 of our Constitution. They're saying that the Trump administration, Pam Bondi's Trump Justice Department, is saying, yes, Judge Boasberg ordered those flights grounded. Yes, we defied that order. But a month later, the Supreme Court ruled that this isn't his jurisdiction. But we all know that's not how the courts work. We know this. In our courts, when it comes to temporary restraining orders, there's something called exigencies. Exigencies. Meaning federal judges must act quickly to prevent the irreversible. So it may not be my jurisdiction, but until we determine that it's not my jurisdiction, this is my jurisdiction. Exigencies, where a judge has to rule quickly, like those 3 planes cannot take off. Immigrants cannot be wrongly shipped to a prison in El Salvador. It's an emergency because that may be irreversible, which we're seeing the Trump administration trying to make it irreversible. So Judge Boasberg's temporary ruling that blocked the flights, that was never overturned by the courts. It was disobeyed by the Trump Justice Department, by Kristi Noem, by Pam Bondi, by ICE. Because of time restraints, when Judge Boasberg ordered the flights grounded, that order was the rule. The rule of the land. It had to be obeyed. It was a temporary order, temporarily blocking the flights until the Supreme Court could decide how it wanted to proceed. His order remains valid, despite the court later ruling, practically a month later, that the case should be heard in a different jurisdiction. That's why he ordered the flights grounded, so the Supreme Court would have enough time to figure out how to proceed. The purpose of Judge Boasberg's order blocking the flights wasn't really to save the migrants from deportation. It wasn't to rule on the constitutionality of the Alien Enemies Act. It was to buy the court 2 weeks to decide where and how the courts will decide these issues. Judge Boasberg's order on March 15th, grounding those flights, was final. Final until it is overturned by a higher court. As Pam Bondi would say, period, full stop. That's the law of the land. So I don't see how the Supreme Court, I just don't see how the Supreme Court cannot hold Pam Bondi, Kristi Noem, Todd Blanche in criminal contempt of court. I don't see it. I see other ways to save Trump. I've spent most of the show telling you how I think Trump can do what he wants to do. I don't see how Pam Bondi, Todd Blanche, Emil Bove, Kristi Noem, how the Supreme Court doesn't find them in criminal contempt. They have zero legal standing. And you can tell that the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security and Trump's enablers in Congress know that the Justice Department and ICE and Homeland Security have zero legal standing on the issue of criminal contempt. You know that they know that because the Trump administration has already jump-started impeachment proceedings for Judge Boasberg. When Congress is on a 2-week break, when they come back, I can assure you, the House Judiciary Committee, they are going to begin hearings on Judge Boasberg because they can't win this one. They can't win criminal contempt before the judges, so they're trying it in the court of public opinion. They are gonna try to destroy Judge Boasberg. All right, let me, I should wrap it up. Yeah, okay. You should thank the ACLU. They are the ones who have been fighting for these migrants. And their plight still remains up in the air. The Supreme Court's order early Saturday was just that, an order. There was zero reasoning behind it. Justices Alito and Clarence Thomas were the only two dissenting. It was a 7-2 ruling. It was the ACLU that brought this before the Supreme Court. So think of the ACLU when you have $5 extra sitting around. If you have $5 that you're thinking of blowing on stale, union-busting Starbucks coffee, which, according to Channel 4 in Great Britain, may be picked by children in Guatemala. You never know, according to Channel 4 in Great Britain, whether your Starbucks coffee, if the beans were picked by a child in Guatemala, instead of giving $5 to the union-busting Starbucks, give it to the ACLU. Give it to publiccitizen.org, which is also, I think they've taken 10 or 12 cases to the Supreme Court. All right, I'm David Feldman reminding you to stay strong and protect the weak. I know this isn't entertaining. I know. I know. I don't know what to tell you. Thank you to Bob and Mila for keeping the conversation in the chat room civil. Thank you to all my listeners. I cannot thank you enough. It's a privilege to prepare shows like this and share my information with you. So thank you for listening. Please hit the like button. Please share it with like-minded people. Leave a comment if I got anything wrong. There are a couple questions I asked, so please answer them. Don't be scared, be angry. Don't be scared, be angry. It's not as bad as they want you to think it is. Okay? Identify the pain points. Who's in pain? And help those people. Abrego Garcia, his family. Identify genuine people in pain. No white lady tears. Don't make this about you, right? During Black Lives Matter, remember white lady tears when white women would cry and make it about, it's not about, unless it's about you, don't make it about you. If you're an American citizen, and you don't think, and you're not feeling the pain, go find somebody who is. Because there are people who are being persecuted and who are in pain. Don't make this about you. That's narcissism. If you're an American citizen and you have a roof over your head and you can afford to speak out and you can roll the dice, if you get arrested, you don't think you're going to, if you're that in that position, spare me your white lady tears. Get in the game. Don't tell me you're upset, you're scared, you're depressed. Go F yourself. This isn't about you. It's about people who are in serious trouble. Go help them. Thank you.